and we are live with Neel Kashkari and Alan Page. Neel Kashkari is the president of the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. Also, if I understand right, a banker and scientist by trade and former candidate for governor in the state of California, my birthplace, lovely state of California. And Supreme Court Justice, State Supreme Court Justice Alan Page is a longtime advocate, jurist, education supporter, but also more notable for me, a member of the famed Purple People Eaters of the Minnesota Vikings, my longtime team of note here in Minnesota. And both of these gentlemen have been pushing recently a very important constitutional change, a change to the constitutional amendment that guarantees every child in the state of Minnesota a quality education. People who don't live in Minnesota might not know that we are a fabulous state with a great standard of living. We have great access to government services. We have a strong civic system, and we have great community partners when it comes to corporate and government, and just a long-standing commitment to great civic systems is what we can say about Minnesota. And at the same time, what people have heard me say before on this show is we also have a shameful gap and disparity in educational outcomes, specifically for children of color, but also including, as these gentlemen have noted in recent reports and op-eds, also including though white students who fall down the economic spectrum. So we have poor white students that also are not doing as well as the majority population in the state of Minnesota. So that's what we want to talk about today. Good morning, fellas. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
So I want to start with the most obvious question to me is you two are proposing a change to the Constitution of Minnesota that is a language change to guarantee a quality education. And that opens up a lot of questions immediately, like why a constitutional amendment? You've had this question before. I've seen you in other interviews fielded already. And also the definition of quality, like a quality education, being specific about that. So why don't we start there, because I would love to say what your proposal is, what it is not, and what you expect it to do. But at the beginning, why a constitutional amendment rather than a lawsuit or some legislative change or some other version of proposal?
Well, thank you. I'm happy to start, and then I'll turn it quickly over to Alan. Just the statistics that you cited about these education disparities. When I moved to Minnesota almost 5 years ago, I was surprised to discover, for all the reasons you said, so many strengths that Minnesota has, I was really surprised to discover these terrible education gaps. So I challenged our researchers to help me understand why they're there, what has been done to close them, what have the results been, and what's been done around the country. And what we learned is that over the last several decades, there have been many attempts in Minnesota to try to close education disparities, but we've made no progress, zero progress. And if you look around the country, there are some states that have made progress. So this is not an impossible problem to solve. You don't have to first end poverty. Other states have poverty too, and yet they're making progress in closing the education disparities. And an observation that I had is it seemed as though politics were getting in the way. And what I mean by that is Republicans have one set of education solutions that they favor. Democrats have a different set of education solutions that they favor. They don't agree. So what do? The reforms that get passed are little minor reforms in the middle that don't fundamentally change the system because both sides can't agree. So about 2 years ago, I reached out to Justice Page, both because I knew he spent 22 years on the Supreme Court. I also knew he had a lifetime of passion and work in education. I asked Justice Page, is there a way we could use the legal system to try to break through the political logjam and really put children first? Everybody says that they're for children first, but it's usually the adults who get in the way of actually making changes that will put children first. And so when we looked at the existing Minnesota Constitution. The education provision was literally written in 1857 when slavery was still legal in much of the country, and it has not changed since then. Many other states have updated their constitutions for modern times, and we looked around those states and said, what can we learn from other states to bring Minnesota's constitution into the 21st century, and then be a catalyst for major changes to come in transforming our education system. So that was the basic background behind it. But let me turn it over to Alan to talk about how we think it'll work and why we think it's the right tool.
And let me just begin by noting that we're talking about quality public education, not simply quality education. We are talking about quality public education. That is the centerpiece, if you will, of our proposal. The Minnesota Constitution, which Neel noted was Article 13, the educational provision of our Constitution, was adopted in 1857 and hasn't changed substantively since then. The current Constitution focuses on the educational system and funding for that system. We believe that the thing that is missing is a focus on children. I mean, that's what education is really all about, educating young children. And so we literally, in our proposed language, put children first. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education. That right is something that gives children and their families power, the power to have a voice in how we proceed at this point with the disparities we have, how we proceed in terms of eliminating those disparities, but also bringing all children, creating for all children the opportunity to participate fully in our society. I should probably just share the language with you. All children have a fundamental right to a quality public education that fully prepares them with the skills necessary for participation in the economy, our democracy, and society, as measured against uniform achievement standards set forth by the state. It is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfill this fundamental right. I would note that the quality standard, the standard to be met is that the education fully prepares children for participation in our economy, our democracy, and our society. The measurement tool, which is required by the language as measured against uniform achievement standards set forth by the state, is something that we believe is important so that all children are measured by the same standard. You know, we could end these disparities today if we used a different standard for children of color and economically disadvantaged white children. We could eliminate those disparities today. That wouldn't solve the educational problem. And so we think it's important that everybody be measured by the same standard. And I would note that the measurement tool, the uniform achievement standards, that's simply a measurement tool. It is not the standard to be met in terms of quality public education. That's just how we measure whether children are being fully prepared for the quality public education.
I think you're on mute.
There we go. Sorry about that. I think that part is important about how we measure, because that's going to become not going to become, it's already a topic of concern for folks that are arguing about this particular amendment or this change to the constitutional language. The Commissioner of Education, Mary Catherine Ricker, in the state of Minnesota, actually had put forth something a while back, an op-ed that basically said we need to be positive about the measures that we have, and we need to have a more broad look of how we measure the outcomes in the state of Minnesota. And the report from our Department of Education highlights things like the improvements that we've made around graduation rates, for instance, the advancements that we've made about the number of kids that stay in school or that are not chronically absent anymore. So if you look at the report that the department issued a while back, it paints a picture of progress, of educational progress, like we're trending in the right direction. And I've heard you all say in interviews that your research does not tell us that we're trending in the right directions. What do you think is the difference between the way the department is looking at the numbers and highlighting things like improvements in graduation rates, for instance, like, you know, more Black students, for instance, graduating in 4 years and in 7 years. So both ways that they look at it, and they see that as a positive, like we're trending the right direction already.
Well, the challenge is, you know, if you look at, we could graduate everybody tomorrow. We could have 100% graduation rate. We could declare victory. But as Alan just said, we would not have actually accomplished anything, because are those students well prepared for their lives as, you know, workers in the economy, as future parents, as contributors to our society? And just graduating everybody by lowering standards doesn't actually accomplish anything. So that's why we do look at graduation rates, and we do want all Minnesota kids to graduate, but we want to make sure that they actually have the necessary skills to succeed in life. And if they want to go on to college or go on to a technical school, make sure that they are well equipped to do that. And if you look at those measures of actual college readiness, the gaps are not getting any better. If anything, they're getting bigger. And so, unfortunately, I think looking just at graduation rates is an easy way out, and it sends a misleading picture of how we are doing in preparing our young people for their futures.
Yeah, because in some ways, I mean, we have a comment here. Someone said you're graduating uneducated. There are more people graduating. A high school diploma in some ways is a ticket to some part of the workforce. When you don't graduate with one, life is very different for you. But it still doesn't mean that we're closing the gaps in terms of, we have a robust corporate sector with lots of job opportunities in Minnesota. We're like blessed with them. You are not getting into that workforce with just a high school education. You have to
And we hear it. And that, by the way, people ask me, why does the Federal Reserve care about this? We care about this because one of our mandates that Congress, the United States Congress, has given us is maximum employment. And what that means is as many Americans as possible gainfully employed and participating in the economy. And as you just said, if you want to get a job at any of Minnesota's great companies, you're going to need a good education as the ticket to get in. And Alan and I meet with many of the CEOs of those companies. They want to hire Minnesotans. But they're saying if Minnesota does not equip its young people with the skills they need, then they're going to have to hire people in other states or around the country. And so it's a win-win for everybody if we can really make sure that all Minnesota's young people are getting the good education that they deserve.
Yeah, so a question for you around, and this more for you, to think about the reforms that have already happened. Minnesota has been a national leader in things like desegregation plans, experimental schools, peer assistance review and teacher evaluation, post-secondary enrollment options, charter schools. I could keep going down the list in the number of reforms that Minnesota has led the country in. Like we were, going all the way back to the 60s, we were considered a model state, in Minneapolis, a model city on some of these reforms. So why now do you think that this actually does better than all the things that have been tried before? We've had all these other reforms. How does this actually improve upon the reform landscape where so many others didn't really close the deal? They may have made improvements, but they didn't really close the deal on better academic outcomes.
Was that for me or was that for Alan? Happy to either one.
For Mr. Page, we could start with you because you have a long-term view of Minnesota.
Yeah.
You've seen us actually try many things. You've seen us go through a lot of these reforms, and they haven't ended with us closing the gaps.
Because we haven't put children first. I think if you look at each one of these, the things that we've done over time, we talk about reform, but really we're talking about quite often how much money the system has to do whatever it is it's trying to do. We have to educate the individual child. That's something that we haven't done. And we think that our provision, given the central focus on children and putting children first, and giving children a voice, giving children's families a voice in creating an education system that works for them, for the individual child, we think that is powerful in terms of creating real change. Obviously, all the things we've done haven't worked. They've gotten us to where we are today. And we think that this proposed language will be a catalyst for real change.
If this language is approved.
Can I add one quick thing? I'm sorry.
Sure. Go ahead.
One quick thing is my observation, being fairly new to Minnesota, is a lot of the changes that we've made are superficial. They look good. Minnesota's got open enrollment. You can send your child to any public school in the Twin Cities you want, except you can't. They have to approve you. And some of the best schools in Minnesota in the Twin Cities take very few children from outside of their district because they can pick and choose who they want to let in. And then you have to find a way to get your child there. If it's driving them across town, how do you get your child there and still make it to your job? So we can tell everybody in the country, we've got open enrollment. We're so progressive. We're so forward thinking, but it's window dressing. It's not real.
Yeah. It's not really a choice if you can't get your kid there. If there are barriers and we've seen this in history where, we've increased the ability to vote, but we put barriers in the way of voting. There are soft barriers you can put into any right. And I think that's true about our choice system in Minnesota. But whenever I hear about parents having more power in these type of discussions is when my ears open up and I perk up. I'm like, okay, so there's more power for the parent. If this language were to change in the state constitution, what happens to me as a parent in terms of power? What do I have now that I didn't have before because this language change happens?
Well, because education is now a civil right for your child, those who are in the positions of power, whether it be the legislature, whether it be school boards, whether it be the governor, whoever it is, they now have to listen, because not only does our provision create the right, it creates a remedy for that right. Remedies which today don't exist. And that is something that I think will enable, or not enable, but require educators and those in the education system to actually listen to what the individual child needs.
So what would be one of the remedies? Or what are some of the remedies? Like what can I do now that I couldn't do before?
Well, if I'm an individual child who is being left behind by the educational system, that I'm not being prepared fully to participate, I have a cause of action. I can go to court and say, look, judge, my right to a quality public education is not being fulfilled. Here are the reasons why. And the judge will make a determination, either yes or no. And that is a powerful incentive, I think, for those of us in charge to get it right.
I mean, one piece of feedback that we've received, so we've gotten a lot of feedback from lots of different people, and it's interesting. We have a lot of support from legislators of color whose children are most being affected by these gaps. We also have a lot of support from conservative legislators from greater Minnesota whose kids are also being affected by these gaps. The people who are resisting this change the most are the people who are in charge today, because if you're giving power to families who don't have power today, some people feel like they must be giving up power. I must have to give up power if we're going to give power to working families. And we've met with legislative leaders, some of whom have said, well, we're afraid of the courts getting involved in education. And our answer is, if this amendment passes, the legislature and the governor will have the opportunity to come together with the people of Minnesota to design a new education system, to make the sweeping changes that are needed to help all children succeed. And only if you fail to do that would children and their parents have a need to then go to court to say my child's rights are being violated by the failing education system. And so the legislators say, well, then we don't need this. We can just do it on our own. We can come together and make these changes. And our answer is, well, what have you been waiting for? We've had these gaps for decades.
Right.
What have you been waiting for? And so if anything, this is a catalyst to drive transformational change, both a carrot and a stick. If you don't do your jobs, then families will have the ability to go to court if they need to.
One of the criticisms that this has received is exactly that, is that families will go to court. And that I've heard a very unique or novel pushback on this proposal, which is it'll just clog up the courts. There'll just be so much litigation that the courts will get clogged up with lawsuits from parents, and it'll be costly. It'll be expensive. It'll put the wrong pressures on the system. And so I would just ask you two, why do you want to clog up the courts with a bunch of lawsuits?
Well, that's what courts do. And I don't know that creating a cause of action, giving children a fundamental right will clog them up any more than anything else. That's number one. The other thing is, litigation is not going to be the first step, but if it comes to that step, those being sued don't have to try to defend the indefensible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And right now, they are defending the indefensible. When the few lawsuits that come up, they are defending the indefensible. They don't have to do that. It doesn't have to be expensive. You can sit down and figure out what the right solution is, reach an agreement, and go forward. Litigation is not the ogre that we try to make it out to be. And I would just note that whatever the cost of litigation, whatever additional cost of litigation might come about with respect to this proposed amendment, it pales in comparison to the economic loss that we are faced with by children who are being left behind, by children who end up in our criminal justice system, by children who grow up to be unproductive members of our community. The cost, whatever the cost of litigation, they will never approach those numbers.
Yeah, and President Kashkari, I think this is a good place for you to step in with Minnesota, the Minneapolis Fed actually over time has done a lot of research around the workforce in Minnesota and the pathways to some of the best jobs here, and gaps in the ability to have workers necessary. We have a world-leading financial services industry in Minnesota. We have a world-leading marketing. We have a surplus of marketing jobs in Minnesota. The industry is pretty strong here. If you were to study these industries, you would find that some of them have almost no people of color coming into them. And what leaders of those industries will tell you is that your schools are not preparing us a pipeline of people. It's not that we don't want them. We look for them. As a matter of fact, some of our industries get on planes and go to other parts of the country to recruit people to move to Minnesota to take some of these jobs. So when I hear about costs, the cost of not doing something, it seems like you would be almost an expert on the cost of not actually producing more college-ready, job-ready people of color in the state of Minnesota.
No, I think that's right. And just as you said, they have to go out of state to recruit people to try to get them to come to Minnesota. Meanwhile, we have lots of people in Minnesota who are not gainfully employed, who want to work, who want to be productive contributors to our economy. So that's why the business community is strongly with us. This is a very interesting proposal in that we've united very liberal DFL legislators of color with conservative Republicans from greater Minnesota. We've united the Attorney General, Ellison, with the business community. The Minnesota Business Partnership is strongly behind this because all of them realize that educating all Minnesota's kids is in everybody's interest. This is, the thing about knowledge is it's not a fixed resource where if I gain knowledge, that means you're going to have less knowledge. Knowledge can be shared widely, and it's everybody gains if all of us are better educated, both in terms of our economy, our society, and in terms of our democracy. And the one other point on lawsuits, to build on what Alan was saying, if you look at the history of our country, there are pivotal civil rights lawsuits where one lawsuit for one individual, one plaintiff, leads to change for everybody. And so think about everybody is hailing the amazing career and life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Some of her landmark actions was when she was as an attorney before she became a judge or a justice. And those transformed equal rights for women, for all women, not just for her one plaintiff. And that's what's so potentially powerful about this amendment and why we don't, as Alan said, we don't think lawsuits is the first step. But if it goes down the path of a case, that could actually lead to better outcomes for all Minnesota's children.
And can I just note one thing? Every child that gets left behind is a diminished employee, potentially, is a diminished taxpayer, is a diminished customer for the businesses here in Minnesota. We just can't continue to leave those children behind and expect that we as a community are going to grow and prosper.
I think it was interesting that the way that your op-ed, one of the op-eds that you wrote about this framed it was in terms of the moment that we live in right now, where much of society is having to rethink its kind of racial injustices and its systemic racial injustices. Here in Minneapolis, we had a large, I don't know what you would call it, a catalyst almost to a movement nationally with the outcome of the George Floyd news reports, things that came out of that nationally, and lots of unrest, which Minneapolis and Minnesota have been through that before. We've had these moments where things have burned down and then everybody had to come together and rethink the way our systems work. So we're in that moment again. And I think what you have put forward is education has to be part of that rethinking, which I think is novel because, while most everybody is thinking about criminal justice and policing, if you go upstream, you get to education every single time on every issue. If you go upstream, you come back to education, K-12 education, no doubt about it. So I thank you all for actually bringing that to light. But this is what I want to say now. I looked at something that showed support because I would hear your proposal and think, who could be against that? This makes perfect sense. Like everybody should have a quality education. I mean, that, that's like, to say something opposite of that is like kicking kittens. Like, who would be against every child having a quality education? Well, in Minnesota, a poll from Our Children, the coalition did some polling. 79% of Minnesotans favor this amendment, or this change to language. I shouldn't call it an amendment, this change to the language of the state constitution. 92% of Democrats, 83% of independents, 65% of Republicans. 2/3 agree that education should be a top responsibility of state government. A very small percentage actually believe that the schools are just fine the way that they are, and everything should be status quo. But there's one group that is not actually with you all on this, and that is the teachers union, which I find interesting, because this is the group that represents the 80,000 educators in the state of Minnesota. And you would think that they have something to say about these type of proposals. They don't favor this language change. And I wonder two things. One, why do you think that is? And two, what do you do to appease their concerns, to kind of address the concerns that they have about the outcomes of this proposed change?
Well,
go ahead, Alan.
I was just going to say, to be blunt, I think it's about power. Neel mentioned earlier that when those of us who are in charge think we have to give up power, we react in ways that are not necessarily consistent with what our ultimate goals are.
We reached out to the Education Minnesota early on in this process, and Alan and I have been very clear. We want to make this language as powerful and as effective as we can. And if anybody has suggestions on how to make it better, we're open-minded to making it better. So we reached out to Education Minnesota early on. They said, wow, this is very interesting. We want to study this, and we're probably going to come back to you with some suggested changes, but we're excited about this. So Alan and I were very encouraged from our first meeting. A couple of weeks later, maybe 3 weeks later, they came back to see us and they said, no, we don't have any language changes. We're opposed to this. We're going to fight you. And we were shocked by that. And, they say that their number one priority is education and making sure that kids are getting a good education. How can they be opposed to a civil right to a quality public education? And, we had other people come to us and say, hey, if you drop the word public from your amendment, so it's just equal right to quality education, so it could support private schools, they said, we'll support it. And Alan and I said, no, this is about making sure public education is as strong and as high quality as possible. And so we're at a loss to figure out, other than the PowerPoint and the fact that we want to hold the state accountable for outcomes, we're at a loss on how a teachers union could be opposed to this. When we talk to teachers, they love the idea of empowering families and empowering schools and empowering teachers to do what's right for those kids. There's often a disconnect between the bosses and the folks who are in the trenches.
I want to come back to this being about public education for one, because one of the biggest complaints, or I don't know if it's complaints, but concerns that the teachers union have is that this will lead to vouchers, private school vouchers. But aside from that, they also say that this reduces the mandate of the state having a uniform public education system. And for those of us who are not legal people or not deep in the legal language or in legislation and what this means, the state constitution does call for a uniform system of public education. And when they say that this change to the language would shift that, I think that makes a lot of antennas go up, because that's not a minor change. That would be a major change. So what is your response to that concern that they have, that this changes the state being on the hook for a uniform system of public education?
I'm not sure I quite understand their argument, quite frankly. Currently, Minnesota is not the only state in the union that has that uniform language in its constitution. And I think I did a quick survey, and I think there are 5 or 6 states that have that language that also have voucher programs. So
Mm-hmm.
that language doesn't necessarily prevent that from happening, from the state from going down that road. Indeed, the current language, if the governor or if the legislature enacted and the governor signed a bill that took us down the voucher path, they can do that today. Our proposed language, they could still do that with one significant caveat. And that is that last sentence of our proposed language. It is a paramount duty of the state to ensure quality public schools that fulfill this fundamental right. That language makes clear that there would be no higher duty in the state than a quality public schools and a quality public education. And that so while the legislature might choose and the governor might choose to sign in the law provisions that would allow for vouchers, that provision makes it clear that they couldn't do it at the expense of public education.
So it's no more likely to happen. It can happen now without the language change.
It can happen now without the constitutional amendment. It's more difficult with the constitutional amendment.
And even if it passed with the constitutional amendment, which it could happen now anyways, but at least there would still be a focus on quality outcomes for students no matter what.
It would be the paramount duty. No higher duty.
Yeah, I think paramount is pretty much the top, right?
No higher duty.
No higher duty.
To ensure quality public schools.
You know, this is what becomes so complicated, I think, with these issues sometimes, is that there are, you know, every state has a state constitution. If you were to look at all of them, as I believe you all have done, they have differences between an adequate education and a uniform system of education. The public doesn't always know what's out there. They don't know the difference. They don't know the difference between us in Florida and us in California and us in Iowa. You know, there's a difference. What about your look broadly at other states boosted your support for what you're proposing here? Like when you looked at other states and took in what you could learn from them, what is it that you think boosted your interest in doing this specific proposal that you have?
Well, one thing is, if you look at Florida, you mentioned Florida. Florida has made some of the best gains in the country of closing the achievement gaps from children of color and white children and low-income children and middle-class children. So Florida is a great example that it is possible to close these gaps. You know, some people say, well, no, it's poverty. You first have to end poverty. Well, I don't know how to end poverty. If I could end poverty, I'd do it tomorrow. But Florida has poverty too, and yet they're making real gains. So gains are possible. And if you look around the country, just take Washington State. They amended their constitution. They also say all children have this fundamental right. And then when the case went to court, the court said, hey, all children means all children. It does not mean most children. It does not mean the median child. It means all children. And so those are some examples of the power that the law can have in being a catalyst for driving change.
And I would just note that Neel mentioned that, you know, we don't know how to end poverty. Well, a good place to begin is with education and ensuring that every child has a good education.
Well, and I would say that the Minneapolis Fed does have some idea of how to close poverty. I mean, we can't have these broken pipelines to major industries, because nothing changes poverty like income.
Correct.
And nothing changes income like a job in a high growth, high wage occupation. And we have many high growth, high wage pathways in Minnesota that are broken, where a kid from North Minneapolis is living a mile or 2 miles from one of a global enterprise that they will never see the inside of, right? And I don't know if you all have been to like General Mills or one of those places. They are fabulous campuses, great places to work. And a mile or 2 away from them, there are kids that will never see the inside of that building who are fully capable of actually earning what people earn in that company. Well, here's something I want to ask about, because it's come up several times about this is about public systems and public education and public, schools. And that comes through. And I understand the concern that that's addressing for people, that this might be some sort of Trojan horse for privatizing education. I get it. But if it really is about putting kids first, and kids learn in many different environments, and there are opportunities in many different environments and types of schools, why would this be so narrowly focused on creating just a system or doubling down on a system that already is not doing very well by our kids? Why not open up the pathways, as Florida and other states have done, to kids learning wherever they can learn in whatever suits their needs? We have schools like Cristo Rey and others in Minnesota that do a very good job with kids of color and kids in poverty and urban kids, for instance. Why would it be so focused on public?
Can I start one quick point on this, which is going back to the word uniform system? Our current provision, the courts have interpreted our current provision as meaning children have rights to accessing an adequate education system. Now, I'm a new dad. I don't know anybody who aspires for their child to get an adequate education. But what does an adequate education system even mean? It means that it's an education system that for some students it works great, for other students it's lousy, and on average it's adequate, and you have the right to accessing that system. And it's just dumb luck if you're at the top of that system or the bottom of that system. So that's what our Constitution has delivered today, a uniform system of adequate. Now, what is uniform and adequate? McDonald's. Mm-hmm. It's uniform. You go to any McDonald's in the country and it's the exact same cheeseburger, the exact same Big Mac, and it's adequate. Now, is that good enough for the children of Minnesota, a McDonald's education system? And so one of the keys that Alan and I wrote in this provision is it's flexible. It doesn't say that every school needs to look exactly the same, because the kids in one part of Minnesota may need different resources, different supports, a different focus than children in another part of the state, just based on their local environment, the job opportunities that are available, for example. So we've been very careful to say that the school districts and the teachers and the parents should design what those kids need in order to be successful. It's not going to be one size fits all. And we think we can do that in all forms of public education, be they traditional public schools, district schools, or public charter schools.
I still feel like you got all the way to the doorstep of my point there.
Well, the reality is that, what is it? 30, I can't remember the precise number of children in Minneapolis public schools today. 32, 3, 4, 5,000, whatever the number is. Are we going to send them all to Cristo Rey tomorrow? What is Cristo Rey going to do?
Well, no, I mean, I would. It's a good point. We won't send them all
because we can't, because those other education, the private education systems can't accommodate all of those children, and never will be able to accommodate all those children. So we have to fix the education system that we have.
I still want to push on this a little bit. No, not all of them are going to go. But if one of them or 10 of them or 15, like the Minneapolis public schools are actually engineered for 52,000 kids. So that almost half of the kids are gone already, meaning they are doing other things. The kids that are left behind are still looking for opportunities that the ones who've already left and gotten out of the school system have dodged. And when we raise questions like this, what people want you to concentrate on first is the system, not the kids that need an opportunity. For instance, someone asked a question in our comments here about how does your proposal affect special education students, for instance. We happen to know that there are a couple of very good special education private schools in the Twin Cities that other people have access to, that you wouldn't have access to if you have autism and you live in North Minneapolis, for instance. So my point isn't to ask, should we just transfer a whole bunch of kids out? It's just maybe to say, for those that want to or can we open up as many pathways to an education for kids, if it really is about putting kids first?
Well, those that want to and can do that today.
With no
Right.
resources, though. Yeah, they have no resources to do it today.
Now, we are either going to have a public education system or a private education system. And the reality is that the vast majority of our children are going to have to be educated in our public system, and we need to fix it. We can't have a system that benefits a few and leaves everybody else behind.
One of the if you dig into the really successful charter schools, and there are some brilliant charter schools nationally, and there's some very good charter schools in Minnesota. There are also some lousy charter schools in Minnesota. One of the things they have in common is they say, well, even the ones in New York, say the Success Academies in New York, that are massively oversubscribed, they get 6 times as many applicants, and they have to run a lottery to pick the kids. So they say, look, we're not cherry picking the best students because we run a lottery. But they're already getting the best parents. Because if the parents know enough about education and care enough about education to say, I want to send my child to Success Academy, you're already getting more engaged parents than the less engaged parents. And so that's great. I mean, I want those kids with those parents to get the best education they possibly can. But what do we do about the kids whose parents don't know enough? They love their kids, but they don't know enough about how to get a good education or where to find that good education. And so I think Alan and I are saying, yes, private schools have a very important role to play. And if parents want to send their kids to private school, that's great. But we need to fix the system so we get all the kids being lifted up. And I would also just say one practical consideration. The only way this amendment is getting on the ballot is if it has bipartisan support.
Mm-hmm.
And if this was an amendment about private schools and vouchers, it would not have bipartisan support, and it would be dead on arrival. And so
I feel like that's the truer response to this question, is that there's a political calculus around the fact that if you're being fought by the institutional folks, and including teachers unions, on just putting a proposal that improves public education, you for sure would never actually get through the gate on proposing anything that liberates kids to have a wider assortment of choices beyond just the system in which those folks work.
And I would just add, from my perspective, my only interest is in public education, because that's where the children are. And we have an obligation to educate all children, not just some children, all children. And so the notion that somehow we should develop a system that provides for the few, whoever they might be, wherever they might fall in the spectrum, that, for me, that's just a non-starter, irrespective of the politics of it. The practicality of it is that if we don't prepare all children for success in the future, then we're really just wasting our time.
So I want to address just a couple of things about this point, because I think it's a very important point, because what all of this boils down to me is opportunity. What are the pathways to opportunity? It's the most important thing to me. And when I look at people who watch this who don't know Minneapolis, don't know the Twin Cities, if I mention North Minneapolis, they're not going to understand. But you understand it this way. If you live in Seattle, I'm talking about South Seattle, right? Every city has a south or a west or an east or a place that that the roads to opportunity seem to be shut off. Like there seems to be like a toll gate that prevents you from leaving where you are to getting to the places where you can enjoy the prosperity of the city that you live in. And Minneapolis is no different than that. We have parts of the city where the gates to opportunity seem to be shut for some, not for everybody. We have developed systems for how a few get out. Years ago, one of the ways was a desegregation plan that allowed you, if you lived in 2 zip codes, to go out to the suburbs and get an education. And I don't know how many kids are doing that now. It's called the Choice is Yours program. It never was more than 3,000 kids getting out of that part of the city, but it was heralded as this great kind of, road to an opportunity for some, but not for all. I think that the people who proposed that particular program would still want to beef it up, still would want that to be one of the primary ways that we present opportunity. I only raise this to say that it seems like most all proposals are going to target to help some kids get out of the situation. So when I bring up the thing around private schools, I'm not thinking everybody's going to get there. I'm just thinking it is going to be an addition to all the other routes, like the Choice is Yours program right now is one of those routes. And we have others that specialize. And there are going to be kids with autism or specific types of special needs that are never going to be the needs of all the students, but some will need to get out. We need a fairly robust system. But I don't want to keep pushing that because I get where you guys are coming from with it being about public. I do want to address the comment about Success Academy. I actually don't love the narrative around those are better parents because they apply to get into a lottery, and that somehow the parents that don't apply to go to Success Academy are necessarily not at the same level as the ones. And all you have to do is visit that school and some of the schools next to it, and even some of the schools where they co-locate, to find that it pretty much is like you have the parents have one kid in Success and one in the regular system. And the ones in the regular system oftentimes are making a choice too. Like, I think we often paint them as people that are just left behind. Some of them are making choices not to apply for Success Academy on purpose too. So I just want to address that point. But coming back to Minnesota, some of the prep that you guys sent me were some of the things that I've seen previously. One of them, 2 numbers stick out to me. 26% of Black students are on grade level in math achievement and 33% in reading achievement. Those numbers to me are not taken as serious when we get into the political discussions about whether the system should be public or not, whether this is going to increase the number of lawsuits or not. Like most of the feedback on and the criticism of your proposal to me doesn't seem to take those 2 numbers serious enough, because in my mind, I say this all the time, those aren't numbers, those are prophecies. Those 2 numbers I just said to you actually are telling you what the future looks like for an entire group of people in Minnesota. It would seem to me that people would be willing to do as much kind of broad reform and change as they possibly could to take those 2 numbers seriously. Do you feel like you're in your final analysis that even the pushback that you're getting is showing that we're not serious enough yet? We're just not even there yet in the discussion to be able to have a vigorous enough discussion about the problem if you're getting pushback just on some changing of the words that give everybody a right to a quality education.
I would say absolutely you're right. If it was the majority population where 25 or 30% of their kids were actually proficient, this problem would have been solved decades ago. And so the question for us in Minnesota is, are we serious about anything, about the criminal justice reforms, about the economic disparities, about the education disparities? Are we actually serious that we are willing to do what's necessary to close these gaps and to have everyone in our society succeed? I hope the answer is yes, but I don't know that yet.
I couldn't have said it better.
We're just not serious enough about these numbers yet. The level of the problem isn't before us. I love what you just said too. If this was a problem with the majority population, we probably would have changed the way that we do everything. The way that we staff schools, the way that we use the budget, the way that we, the curriculum, the pedagogy. So as we wrap here, we're getting to the final minutes. This is closing arguments time, right? So the big argument against what you were proposing is a lot of what we already touched on. It's not a fix is one of the arguments. It will clog the courts with useless litigation is one of the pushbacks, items for pushback. It'll open the door to privatization of education. It's another piece of the pushback. And it will allow legislators to punt their responsibility on providing for great schools and a uniform system of education. There's probably some other pushback that I haven't mentioned yet. In your final analysis, your final argument to the public here locally and even nationally, folks who are watching, what's the final analysis of how you overcome all the objections? Like, what is the case for the change that you're proposing that overcomes all the objections?
Well, I would just say what we're really talking about when we talk about ensuring quality public education is justice. We're talking about educational justice. We're talking about social justice. We're talking about racial justice and creating opportunity for everyone, every child to fully participate in what we as a society, what we as a community, what we as an economy have to offer. And as you noted, those percentages, they're unconscionable. They are unconscionable. I mean, it is hard to sit here and think about what we are not doing, which allows those numbers to persist. And what we propose is a catalyst for real change. Will it happen overnight? No. Indeed, if we are able to get this amendment passed, it will be the first step. It won't be the last step. Well, we as Americans tend to look for easy, simple answers. And fixing our educational problems, there aren't any easy answers. There are some simple things we can do, but to get them done will take hard work by all of us.
President Kashkari.
No, I think Justice Page gave a great closing argument, so I will defer to the justice.
Oh, well, that is wise. I actually thank both of you for taking a different approach to a long-standing problem in Minnesota. Our systems are broken. I think everybody who watches this knows that our systems are broken. It's just getting adults to agree upon a course of action that's the problem. Everybody has a proposal. It's like Nashville, everybody has a song in their back pocket, or LA, everybody has a script in their back pocket. Well, in education, everybody has a proposal, but they have no proposal for how we get people to come together just around something simple and what should be inarguable, something that you can't argue against. And that's what I think you have proposed, and I appreciate that. There's a level-headedness to it. I think for everybody watching, if you want more information about the proposal, the amended language here in the state of Minnesota, you can reach me, Christopher at activist.com. You can also look for more information. If you go to ourchildrenmn.com, you will find a lot of information about the proposed language, the public support for it, and the news, the local news about what's taking place with it. So please look it up, take a look at it, see how it applies to you wherever you are. If you are in Minnesota, I would say approach this conversation with a bit of humility and honesty about the level of the problem that we're trying to solve, and about the need for people to get out of their political wheelhouses and out of their parochial thinking and do something more broad, because the level of the problem couldn't be more high. We have a very high opportunity society in Minnesota. We have great pathways to opportunity for most. So it is unconscionable that we have this secret shame that the roads to opportunity are blocked off by needless barriers for too many kids in the state of Minnesota, many of whom are already marginalized by race, economics, and by family status. So let's really think through how we become a fair society. We look for fair solutions that don't just increase and pat ourselves on the back for the prosperity that we have for most, but we have to put the least of them first in some of these discussions. Thank you for joining us today. We've had Alan Page, a jurist, a Supreme Court member, a very, very decorated advocate for education, and also my favorite thing I have to keep mentioning is the storied career with the Minnesota Vikings, and we're not going to talk so much about with the Bears and after the Vikings, but definitely with the Vikings, and Neel Kashkari, who actually has been, I believe, an innovative force in the positions that you've held. Like the Minneapolis Fed leading on an issue like this, to me, was novel. It was different. It was timely. It made a lot of sense. And it seems like, looking at your resume, you've always looked for those type of leadership opportunities, those opportunities to lead from a different direction. So thank you both. I appreciate you two for joining me today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you to everybody watching today. Again, if you want more information, you can reach me at christopher@activist.com, and I will lead you to anything that you want to learn about our guest today or the proposal that they have before the state of Minnesota. Thank you all.